Go ahead and put on a hermeneutical helmet, because we're about to get into the world of Rudolf Bultmann, the man who looked at the New Testament and said, you know what this needs? Less miracles and more existentialism. So get ready for a wild ride through the demythologization, form criticism, and some very creative biblical interpretation. Let's talk about the early years. Born in 1884 in Germany, Rudolf Bultmann was the son of a Lutheran pastor. It's like he was born with a Bible in one hand and a question mark in the other. Little did his parents know that their bouncing baby boy would grow up to shake the foundations of biblical interpretation. And Bultmann came of an age during a period of intense theological and philosophical fermentation in Germany. It was like the Avengers' Infinity War of ideas, with different schools of thought duking it out for supremacy. And young Rudolf, he soaked it up like a theological sponge. He studied at some of the best universities in Germany, where he was exposed to the latest in biblical criticism and existential philosophy. It's like he was trying to build his own intellectual smoothie, blending liberal theology, existentialism, and a dash of good old-fashioned German skepticism. By the time Bultmann began his academic career, he was already showing signs of that theological maverick that he would become. He wasn't content with traditional interpretations of the Bible. Oh, no. Bultmann wanted to dig deeper, to get to the real meaning behind the text. He saw himself almost like an Indiana Jones of biblical study, always hunting for the hidden treasure of authentic faith beneath the surface of what he would call ancient myths. Famous or infamous, depending on who you ask, idea is this concept of demytholization. Now, before you start picturing Bultmann running around with a big eraser, frantically rubbing out all the cool parts of the Bible, let's kind of break this down. Demytholization isn't about getting rid of myths, it's about reinterpreting them. Bultmann argued that the New Testament is full of mythical elements that were meaningful to ancient people, but he saw them as stumbling blocks for modern minds. Things like a three-tiered universe, miracles, and supernatural beings. So he was saying, guys, we need to update the Bible's operating system for the modern world. And so for Bultmann, the goal was to strip away the mythical packaging and in his mind reveal the existential core of the Christian message. He wanted to translate the kerygma, which was the kind of core proclamation of the Christian faith, into terms that would be meaningful for modern, scientifically minded people. Now, here's the kicker. Bultmann wasn't trying to necessarily disprove the Bible. In his mind, he wasn't even watering down Christianity. He genuinely believed he was doing Christianity a solid by making it relevant to the modern world. In his mind, he was just going to give the New Testament a makeover for its big debut in the 20th century. He was heavily influenced by existential philosophy, particularly of Martin Heidegger. He looked at the New Testament and thought, you know what, this needs more angst and authenticity. And so for Bultmann, the real message of the New Testament wasn't about supernatural events or even metaphysical claims. It was about authentic existence. He believed that when the New Testament talked about things like the eternal life or the kingdom of God, what it was really talking about was a new way of existing in the here and now. So Bultmann was the first theologian to say YOLO. But in a deeply philosophical and, of course, existential way. And he wanted people to understand that the Christian message was about living authentically in the face of death and meaninglessness, not about this kind of pie in the sky when you die. The third big piece to understanding Bultmann's thinking is form criticism. Bultmann was a pioneer in form criticism, and this is just a method of biblical analysis that looks at the different forms or genres within the text and tries to trace their development in the early Christian community. So sort of think of it like this. Bultmann was the detective who looked at the New Testament and said, this isn't just one book. It's a collection of different types of literature. And he identified various forms like miracle stories, pronouncement stories, and passion narratives. But here's where it gets spicy. Bultmann argued that many of these forms developed in the early Christian community before they were written down. And so he's sort of saying, folks, the Gospels aren't eyewitness accounts, they're more like a game of theological telephone. And this approach allowed Bultmann to peel back layers of tradition to try and get to the earliest and, in his sense, most authentic forms of the Christian message. It's like he was doing an archaeological dig, but instead of digging in the dirt, he was excavating layers of text. The fourth part to understanding Bultmann is the Christ of faith versus the Jesus of history. Bultmann made a very sharp distinction between the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. He argued that we can know very little about the historical Jesus, and what's more, he didn't really think it mattered that much to faith. For Bultmann, the important thing wasn't what happened in first century Palestine, but what happens when the Christian message confronts us in the present. It's as if he was saying, stop obsessing over whether Jesus turned water into wine and focus on how his message can transform your life now. Now, this idea was shocking to many traditional Christians, and still is today, who thought historical facts were crucial to faith. But for Bultmann, faith was about existential encounter, not necessarily historical knowledge. He was one of the first theologians to say it's not about the destination, historical facts, it's about the journey, the existential encounter. Now, he was also the theologian in action. Let's talk about the Marburg years. This is where the demythologization magic happened. Bultmann spent most of his career teaching at the University of Marburg. It was here that he developed and refined his radical ideas. So imagine a kind of theological think tank where existentialism, biblical criticism, and German efficiency all collided. Well, that was Bultmann's Marburg. His lectures were legendary. Students would crowd into his classroom eager to hear the latest in cutting-edge biblical interpretation. He was sort of a rock star of theology, but instead of groupies asking for autographs, he had students begging for existential insights. And when Bultmann published his essay on demythologization in 1941, it was like he lobbed a theological hand grenade into the world of biblical studies. The debates that followed were intense, with scholars taking sides and arguing passionately for or against Bultmann's ideas. Some hailed him as a visionary who was saving Christianity from irrelevance. Others accused him of gutting the faith of everything meaningful. It was the theological version of the Sharks versus the Jets, but with fewer dance numbers and a lot more footnotes. Now, Bultmann's influence was so significant that he spawned his own school of thought. His students and followers continued to develop his ideas, sometimes in ways that even Bultmann himself found too radical. But here's the twist. Some of Bultmann's most famous students ended up disagreeing with him. Scholars like Ernest Caseman argued that we can know more about the historical Jesus than Bultmann thought. It's like Bultmann was the Obi-Wan Kenobi of biblical studies, training a bunch of young Jedi who would eventually challenge their master. Now, Rudolf did have his quirkier side. In fact, the demythologizer, he couldn't do that to Christmas. Despite his reputation for stripping away mystical elements from the Bible, Bultmann loved traditional Christmas carols and couldn't bring himself to demythologize them. It's like he was saying, I'm going to do this to everything except we're keeping silent night. He was also the technophobe theologian. He was famously skeptical of modern technology. He never learned to drive a car and was suspicious of radios and television. I wonder what he thought about birds. And it's ironic for a guy who wanted to make Christianity relevant in the modern world. It's like he was living in two centuries at once, 20th century ideas and a 19th century lifestyle. Bultmann was also an avid gardener. Maybe all that demythologizing made him want to get his hands dirty with something concrete. Or perhaps he saw gardening as an existentially authentic way of being in the world with plants. And then he was the theological pen pal. Bultmann maintained a long correspondence with Karl Barth, another theological heavyweight of the 20th century, and their letters are a treasure trove of theological debate and occasional snark. It's like reading a theological version of a rap battle. And then he was the accidental Nazi resistor. During the Nazi era, Bultmann refused to start his lectures with the request, "Hail Hitler." Instead, he would begin with a prayer. And it was a small act of resistance, but it showed that even abstract theologians could take concrete stands. What's Bultmann's lasting legacy? He died in 1976, but his ideas continue to reverberate through the halls of seminaries and theology departments worldwide. Love him or hate him, and there are plenty in both camps, you can't ignore him. Bultmann's call to demythologize the New Testament is still hotly debated. Some see it as the only way forward for Christianity in a scientific age, while others view it as a slippery slope to unbelief. It's sort of like Bultmann opened a Pandora's box of hermeneutical questions that we're still kind of trying to sort out. And then Bultmann's existential interpretation of Christianity, it paved the way for later existential and process theologians. He showed that you could combine cutting-edge philosophy with traditional Christian themes. It's like he created a theological fusion cuisine that's still being sampled and refined today. And then the historical Jesus quest. While Bultmann himself was skeptical about reconstructing the historical Jesus, his work paradoxically sparked renewed interest in the topic. Many of the students went on to lead the new quest for the historical Jesus. It's like Bultmann said, don't look for the historical Jesus, and a bunch of scholars said, challenge accepted. And then Bultmann's work has influenced not just theology and biblical studies, but also philosophy, literature, and even psychology. His ideas about myth and existential interpretation have seeped into various corners of the humanities. It's sort of like he planted theological seeds that have grown into an interdisciplinary forest. And then the ongoing relevance debate. Bultmann's central question, how to make the Christian message relevant to modern people, it's still a hot topic in churches and seminaries today. And every time a pastor tries to relate the Bible to everyday life, they are engaging with Bultmann's legacy, whether they know it or not. And so Bultmann was a theologian who refused to let sleeping dogmas lie. He looked at the New Testament and thought, this could use a good shakeup. From demythologizing to existential interpretation, from form criticism to the Christ of faith. Bultmann challenges us to rethink everything we thought we knew about Christianity. So was he right? Well, that's still up for debate. But one thing is for sure, he did make theology more exciting. And he turned biblical interpretation into a high-stakes game where everything was up for grabs. And while there's much I personally disagree with Bultmann on, I still have found that wrestling with him, it has sharpened my understanding of theology and biblical criticism.